Chapter 1. Purification of the Buddha Field. Reverence to all Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Arya Shravakas and Prachaiga Buddhas in the past, the present and the future. Thus have I heard. At one time the Lord Buddha was in residence in the garden of Amrapali in the city of Vassali, attended by a great gathering. Of bhikkhus there were 8,000, all arhats. They were free from impurities and afflictions, and all had attained self-mastery. Their minds were entirely liberated by perfect knowledge. They were calm and dignified, like royal elephants. They had accomplished their work, done what they had to do, cast off their burdens, attained their goals, and totally destroyed the bonds of existence. They all had attained the utmost perfection of every form of mental control. This is the opening to the Vimalakirti Sutra. This is Chapter 1, Purification of the Buddha Field of a Mahayana Sutra that is composed around 2,000 years ago. It belongs to a collection of sutras that belong to the Prajnaparamita cycle. Prajnaparamita means the wisdom gone beyond sutras. Those who chant the Heart Sutra will know that term. Hanya Haramita is the sort of Sino-Japanese pronunciation for Prajnaparamita. And this sutra of Vimalakirti is very popular in the Zen lineages, although the Zen schools themselves don't have one particular sutra that they ascribe to. There are a number which are popular, and this is one of them, Lankavatara being another one, for example, and obviously the Prajnaparamita too. But the Vimalakirti is a particularly good one, because it's very readable. It's not too long. It's very readable. It has within it many of the major developments of Mahayana thought within it. And for several reasons it's become quite popular, not least of which perhaps is that they're rare amongst the sutras, that there's actually a few jokes in it. We'll be coming to those in due course. So we start first of all with our opening line, the chapter title, which is called Purification of the Buddha Field. And purification, when we come across the term purification in Buddhism, we shouldn't think of this as particularly referring to a moral quality. It refers more to the doctrine of emptiness, shunyata, which actually hadn't been fully developed at the time of the writing of this sutra. That was to come along later with the advent of the 2nd century Indian sage Nagarjuna. But what we do have here is certainly an understanding of that term, the emptiness of self. And purification refers to that. It's the realization of emptiness, the realization, if you like, of shunyata. And the term Buddha field refers to the area of influence of a Buddha. All Buddhas have an area of influence, an area of reach, within which their teachings are expounded and within which they themselves actually teach. And Buddha Shakyamuni, his Buddha field is known as the Saha world. The Saha world is obviously the world in which we live, because this is the place where the Buddha lived and died, and it's also the place where his Dharma exists. Now, the name of the sutra, Vimalakirti is actually a character who appears in the sutra. We'll be coming across him a little bit later on. And the remarkable thing about Vimalakirti is that he's not a monk. He's a layman. In fact, he's a merchant who lives in this town of Vassali, where the Buddha is residing. The town itself, or the city itself, is actually in the modern-day Bihar state in northeast India. Yes, Vimalakirti is a merchant. He's a layman living a lay life, but he's also a great bodhisattva Mahasattva. And the theme that runs through this sutra is that he is the equivalent of the great bodhisattvas in the Buddha's entourage, even of Manjushri. Manjushri also appears in this particular sutra, and in fact there's a nice bit later on where he has entered into debates with people like Shariputra, Moggallana, and many of the sort of minor bodhisattvas, and he bested them all in debating the Dharma. So it's quite clear that despite being a layman, there is absolutely no impediment whatsoever to the practice, to walking the Mahayana, to walking the Great Way. And this is perhaps one of the main central themes of this particular sutra, that the training, the practice, the walking of the Buddha way, the walking of the Great Way, is open to all, irregardless of place. And this is, again, a useful moment just to sort of pause and take stock, because most of us are in lay training. And there's often that sort of nagging feel that somehow, it would be so much easier if I was actually in a more conducive environment, perhaps in a temple or a monastery. And probably most of us have entertained the odd fantasy of what it would be like to be ordained, at least for a little while. And I remember Venerable Myokyoni telling, when she was in Daitokuji in Kyoto in Japan, and although she was there as a laywoman, obviously she was at the temple quite a lot, and she was also very much in contact with people at the Buddhist Society in London, and one of the Buddhist Society people wrote to her telling her about some predicament that he was having in his home life at the time, and really sort of bemoaning the fact of his problems. And he said to her, how much easier it must be for the monks. They don't have to suffer any of this sort of thing. They're really sort of a little bit in their ivory towers, is what he was saying. And Myokyoni wrote back saying, well, that's all very well for you to say, but even though you've got problems at home, actually at work, you can get away from them. But imagine if you lived in a monastery and you fell out with somebody. You cannot get away from them. They are there all the time, and so are you. So the point being that it's always easy to see the grass or to imagine that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. But living in in someone else's shoes can make the same experience appear very different. And really, this now comes back to our task as practitioners who live in a lay life, but who are also walking the Buddha's path. One of the other great themes of the Mahayana is the cultivation and development of skillful means. And perhaps the most important skillful means for us is cultivating the attitude of looking at our daily lives just as it is, as a training ground. Perhaps the main difference between a student of the way and one who is not a student of the way is that there is, in the former, and this of course is true for students of the way too, there is the looking at one's life in purely personal terms, in terms of what I like, what I don't like, what suits me, what doesn't suit me, what I want, and what I will not put up with. All these things, when we look at life in this way, when we look at our own individual life in this way, all these things have I as a reference point. It's me who's at the hub and center of this life. But when it comes to looking at it from a training point of view, actually it becomes something quite different when we begin to give ourselves into what at this moment is being done. When we begin to have to look at those impulses that come up on the inside, when we have to begin to really take into account others. After all, the great way is the Bodhisattva way, and as we're going to see, the Bodhisattva path is very much about others too. It's about all of us, and in fact, obviously we ourselves as individuals are part of that all, but we are just a part of that all. And so our attitude is not what do I want, but what does the situation want? And of course we ourselves are part of that situation. There's always something greater than I. And perhaps having introduced that topic of something greater than I, if we look at just this opening line, reverence to all Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Arya, Shravakas and Prachaiga Buddhas in the past, the present and the future. This exhortation to reverence. Reverence isn't a term that's terribly popular these days, because actually to revere something means to look up to something. And again, I remember Venerable Myokyo-ni often saying that our knee-jerk response, and particularly to a strong I, is to tear things down or to drag things down. Rather than to lift ourselves up, we like to drag things down to our own level. And the problem with that is that it means that there's nothing to aspire towards. And it's quite vain too. But this reverence is very important. And actually the Buddha himself said that without reverence, walking the way is impossible. And in one part, he says to his disciples, you look up to me, you revere me as the Buddha. But who does the Buddha look up to? The Buddha reveres the Dharma. The Buddha looks up to the Dharma. So even the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni, even the Buddha himself has to revere something. So why is it so important that we revere something? Because reverence, if you like, it puts a check on I. If there's something greater than I, then it means that there's something I'm in awe of. There's something that can curtail me, something that holds me in check, something that can act as a restraint. There's a reference point just beyond my own wants, my own wishes, and how things suit me. And really, if we look at our own selfish behaviour, the reason it's called selfish is that I am the hub and centre of it. Well, if there's some ideal greater than that, then that ideal becomes the hub and centre, becomes the new motivator, or the new motivation, if you like. And I become subsidiary to that, in orbit to it, perhaps. On the other side to this, of course, one who has nothing to revere, one who thinks he has attained or become, even the divine, is a very, very dangerous human being. Human beings who think that they are divine or think that they are godlike, very quickly that divine authority and one's personal ambitions become conflated. Unfortunately, for those who are in positions of great power, and either in the greater world or in a smaller sense, it's always a temptation to conflate one's own personal ambitions and to believe that they have, so to speak, a divine authority or a divine sense of being first. And that story, therefore, of the guru who was so holy that birds used to come and drop flowers on him. And this was a great miracle, and people revered him for this. But a Zen master heard about it and thought this didn't quite sound right. And so he went there and gained an audience with him. And actually they got on really well, and they had a long conversation for many hours. And then at one point the guru excused himself in order to go to the toilet, and he disappeared off into the bushes. And whilst he was out, the Zen master got up, went over to the rock on which the guru had been sitting, picked up a piece of chalk off the ground, and wrote the Chinese character for Buddha on the place where the guru had sat, and then went and sat himself down. A few minutes later, the guru came back, and he climbed up onto the rock and was about to plonk himself down. When looking down between his legs, he suddenly realized he was about to put his backside onto the character of Buddha. And he stopped in shock. And in the same moment, the Zen master yelled at him, "What are you waiting for? Sit down." And in that moment, the guru suddenly realized what had been happening to him, and that actually he wasn't free as he thought he was. He wasn't as liberated as he thought he was. And so quite firmly stuck his arse down onto the Buddha. And the story goes that after that incident, never again did birds come and drop flowers onto him. We may think, well, that's rather a pity, really. It's rather nice, isn't it, that image of birds coming to drop flowers on us? But there's something not quite human about it. And we risk our humanity as well. If for some reason I feel that I am above or beyond all this sort of thing, then actually I lose what Kipling called the common touch. That ability to be able to respond with and respond to our fellow human beings. Because part of the human state is that we do make mistakes. I remember Soko Roshi once saying, because he was a very impressive man, and people quite naturally tended to get rather sort of doe-eyed when in his presence. And I remember him once saying, "You think I don't make any mistakes, but I do." And this was at a Buddhist Society summer school over in Gloucestershire. And he said, just this morning, he said, I was eating scrambled egg and I coughed and I spat egg out all over the table and on the person sitting opposite me. I do that sort of thing all the time. But do I want to be perfect? Is that what I'm striving towards? That's a very I-centered ambition, to see myself as beyond reproach. But actually, having a few foibles is quite a natural thing. Again, I remember being at Shobuan once when Myokyoni was alive, and somebody was pouring tea for the rest of us who were sitting around the table, and they were taking a really long time to do it because they were doing it so carefully and so painfully. We were all literally on the edge of our seats. And Myokyoni turned to this person and said, "Why are you taking so long to do that?" And she responded, "Because I want to get it right." And Myokyoni replied, "You're not here to get things right." We may think, well, what are we there for? Surely we go to a temple in order to learn to be good, to be right. No, we don't. We go there to learn to be whole. And that's the thing. We can either be whole, in which case we have to take into account the shadow as well as the light, or we can be right, in which case we set ourselves against the dark. But we cannot be both. So this reverence is something that's very important. It gives us a signpost, something to aspire towards. This is where our ideals are. Reverence to all Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Arya Shravakas, and Prachaiga Buddhas in the past, the present, and the future. Well, the Buddhas we look up to, we know they are the great teachers, and those are the ones who have seen into the nexus of truth. And Bodhisattvas, well, what's a Bodhisattva? Bodhi means awakening, and Sattva means being. And a Bodhisattva is a being who has dedicated himself to walk the way to Buddhahood. And in fact, those of us in the Zen school is a school of the Mahayana, and all Mahayana schools have this Bodhisattva path at its center. We're all on this path together, and we take the Bodhisattva vows. If we go along, we chant the 4 great vows. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to assist them all. The passions are manifold, I vow to transform them all. The Buddha's teachings are many, I vow to learn them all. And the Buddha's way is supreme, I vow to walk it to the end. And we chant that as a method of dedicating merit for the benefit of all beings. When we sit at the society or at Shobuan or wherever, or maybe in our homes too, after we have sat zazen, in order to turn over the merit for the benefit of all beings. And this is what bodhisattvas do. They take this vow not only to walk to attain full Buddhahood, but also to be of benefit to all sentient beings. And in fact, the vow goes so far as to say that until the last blade of grass has entered nirvana, the bodhisattvas shall not set foot in nirvana. So this is the bodhisattva path. Now looking at that, thinking, oh right, okay, here we are in a Mahayana school. We now have to liberate all beings, and we're going to liberate all beings. And yes, there's somebody just over there. I'm going to liberate him. And there's another one over there. I'm going to liberate her. And they're going to be liberated, whether they jolly well want it or not as well. And a little bit, this is where the danger comes with my intentions, because my intentions can very easily become do-gooding. And what it can become, of course, is doing what I think is right for you, what I think is the good thing for you. If we remember, actually, in the Buddha's own life story, his father, King Suddhodana, we remember when the baby was born and the prognostication was made that the child would either become a great world leader or a great religious sage, and his father said he's going to become a great world leader like his father, and kept him in that palace and wouldn't let him go outside, if we remember that. Well, that was his father. His father did that not because he was a dictator. He did it because he thought that was the best thing for his son. You know, he's his dad. Of course he knows what's best for his son. His son should be a king, not some flaky religious teacher. Because he was a king, that's what he understood. These were his values. This was the best that he could be, that he wanted to be, and therefore naturally presumed that the same was true for his son too. And of course this is the problem. I see everything from my own point of view. I do not understand that actually nature has a different stance, and the nature of another may be slightly different. And that nature, of course, informs our values. So, the Bodhisattva, how does the Bodhisattva liberate? The Bodhisattva liberates actually by doing his or her own practice, by being scrupulous with his or her own practice and doing the best and giving him or herself wholeheartedly and sincerely into that practice, actually through the miraculous non-intentionality, what the Chinese called wu wei, non-intentional action. Through non-intentional action, actually this is how it comes about. There's a nice Chinese story that Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, used to tell. In a particular province in China at a certain time, there was a terrible drought. And the people there had tried everything. The priests had made sacrifices, they had sung their hymns to the gods, they had done their magic spells, and nothing would break this drought. And now it was coming to the point where if it went on much longer, the crops would fail and there would be a famine. And finally one of the officials said, well, you know, I've heard of a rainmaker in a different province. Why don't we send for him? So they did, and the rainmaker duly came. And he alighted from the carriage, and they welcomed him and said, well, you know, what do you need? And he looked around and said, well, he said, that little cottage just up there on the hill, I'll use that as my base, and I'll need 3 days. And so he went up into the cottage and he closed the door, and they didn't see him for 3 days. But at the end of that time, the storm clouds gathered, and the rains came, and the drought was broken. And joyfully, this entourage, headed by the local officials, went up to the cottage and knocked on the door, and the rainmaker came to the door and looked at them, and they said, thank you, you've saved us, you've saved our lives, you've averted the famine. We can't thank you enough. And the rainmaker looked at them and said, but I haven't done anything. And the people and the officials said, but you said you needed 3 days, and you've had 3 days, and the rains have come. And the rainmaker said, oh, this is not of my doing at all. No. He said, where I come from, everything happens as it's supposed to. You know, when it's supposed to rain, it rains. When it's supposed to be dry weather, it's dry weather. And it's the same with the people as well. We all do as we're supposed to do in accord with our nature, and we live in harmony as a result of that. But he said, when I came here and I realized at once that you were all out of sorts with yourselves and with each other too. And as I stepped off the carriage and put my foot onto the earth, I too became afflicted with that out of sorts state. And so I realized that the only thing that I could do was to come up here and put my own heart back in order again. And that's all I have been doing for 3 days. It's a strange thing, isn't it? A strange story. What's it pointing to? What's it actually trying to say? Well, there is the doing our own practice. Doing our own practice, cultivating our own heart, not allowing those impulses to ride us quite so much. And just doing that small thing, our own thing, the heart itself now seems to respond. And the heart is a mysterious thing. This is why it's called the heart Buddha. When we revere the Buddha, we're actually revering the heart Buddha. Arya Shravakas. What's an Arya Shravaka? Arya means noble, and it's the same noble that we find in the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. And here now we need to be clear, because Arya, used in the Buddhist sense, doesn't refer to your clan, it doesn't refer to your family or to your race or anything like that. Actually, what it refers to is the ennobling process itself, and this is why they're called the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, because they are the Buddha's way is seen as ennobling. And it doesn't matter who or what we are or what our outer circumstances are. It is always possible to become ennobled, and in fact that's the purpose of the Buddha's teachings. There's a very nice story about Ananda, who was the Buddha's assistant and also the Buddha's cousin as well. And one day, he was a monk, of course, and one day he went to a well in order to get a drink. And there was a woman there, and she belonged to the untouchable caste in India. And so he asked her if she would give him some water to drink, and she replied, "Venerable sir, I cannot. I am an untouchable." And Ananda asked her again if she would give him a drink of water, and she replied again, "Sir, I cannot. I'm an untouchable. If I were to give you something, I would pollute you." And Ananda asked her a third time if she would give him a drink. And finally she relented and did give him a drink. And she was so touched by this that actually she developed a strong affection for Ananda. And she followed him back to the community, and there she went up to the Buddha, and she asked the Buddha if she might become an assistant to Ananda, to Venerable Ananda. And the Buddha asked her why she wanted to do this. And she told him what had happened at the well. And the Buddha nodded and said, he said, "Well, in fact, you've not fallen in love with Ananda. You've fallen in love with his kindness. And if you look inside yourself, you will find that kindness inside yourself too. And if you cultivate that kindness, with it you could serve even kings and queens." It's a really lovely story, but it shows that ennobling process. And Arya Shravaka. Shravaka is a Sanskrit term that means the hearers. They are those that often just refers to the disciples of the Buddhas, disciples of the Buddha. The Shravaka is one who listens to the Dharma, listens to the teaching. But this listening is of a particular kind, because it's not just a matter of sitting in the presence of one who teaches the Dharma. All sorts. We do that all the time, actually, because the world preaches the Dharma to us. Our daily life preaches us the Dharma, but most of the time we don't hear it. And the reason that we don't hear it is that we either don't expect it, or we don't believe it, or because I have some... really because my head is full of my own opinions about things that I'm too full and cannot take notice of anything else. And so that story about the student who goes to the master, asked to become his disciple, and the master sits him down and offers him tea and begins filling the tea cup in front of him, and when it comes to the very brim, he keeps adding tea to it, so it now goes over the top and now makes a huge mess on the table. And finally the student-to-be cries out, "Stop, stop, master, what are you doing? No more can go in." And the master finally stops and says, "Yes, and just as you cannot put more tea into an already full cup, so you cannot pour teachings into a student who is already too full of his own opinions." Now this is, we think, oh yes, nice little story, but actually this really brings to us, because when we look at it at the beginning, when we came into the Buddhist teachings, probably for most of us, if not all of us, we thought, yes, I like this, because actually it confirms my already existing opinions about who I am and what should be and my values and so forth. And that's perfectly natural. There's nothing wrong, obviously, with that. But the point is that sooner or later, something in the Buddha's teachings, or something that comes out of the practice, is going to conflict with one of my cherished opinions. And then what happens? Do we, as the Buddha himself asked us to, do we then test our own opinions, our own deeply held convictions, as a goldsmith tests gold by burning and rubbing? Or do we say, no, that couldn't possibly be, no, I will never believe that, I will never go along with that, and then walk away? Well, it depends how well the practice has gone, but sooner or later, actually, if we walk this path, all my cherished notions, all my convictions become opened up to scrutiny. And even though something may be true, this isn't the point. It's how I hold on to it. It's how I've become attached to it. That has to go. And this is why Master Rinzai says that enigmatic phrase, if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. And not to forget that he said that because Buddha to us means very little. But he was saying this to monks, Buddhist monks, whose whole life was the Buddha. Buddhism, the Buddha Dharma, Buddha philosophy, Buddha meditation. If you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. That really cuts to the core. If I was to take my highest ideal, and Master Rinzai says kill it, because that's what he says. We don't feel so comfortable with that, maybe. So the Arya Shravakas, and finally the Prachaiga Buddhas. Prachaiga Buddha is a Buddha who trains for his own benefit only to attain nirvana. And this was often equated by the Mahayanists with the Arhat path, those who used to go into the forest by themselves and would attain nirvana or attain arhatship. And a little bit it was it's always seen in contrast, and we'll see it later on, often seen in contrast with the Bodhisattva path, which is the for the benefit of all beings in the very much in the world. But the Prachaiga Buddha path is an important one too. If we look at the bull herding pictures, it makes it quite clear. Those 10 bull herding pictures that start with the herdsman and coming into contact with the bull and the tussle and then the gentling process, and then the bull is forgotten, man remains, and then there's the empty circle, and then nature, and then finally at picture number 10 we have entering the marketplace with bliss-bestowing hands, which is where the Bodhisattva comes back. So the Bodhisattva path actually appears right at the end. The first part of that training actually is about tending one's own heart. So, as the Lotus Sutra points out, actually this Prachaiga Buddha path, this Arhat path, and the Bodhisattva path form a seamless whole known as the Ekayana, or the one way. And the rest of this paragraph, thus have I heard, a common way of opening the for all the sutras, reminding us that this was an oral tradition originally. The Buddha is there with all his entourage, and they're described and their powers are met, but really we've already looked at those, because those Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, the Arya Shravakas and the Prachaiga Buddhas are those who actually make up his entourage. So we'll leave it there for now.